boldly engaging the mindless propaganda of our time, apparently with reason. This is Rage of the Age.
This is Rage of the Age, and we have with us today a cold case homicide detective who has been featured on NBC Dateline more than any other detective in the country. He's a senior fellow at Colsen Center for Christian Worldview, adjunct professor of apologetics at Biola University. He's a national speaker, a best-selling author to include Cold Case Christianity, and he has his newest release coming out, which is called Person of Interest. I want to introduce to you today J. Warner Wallace. Mr. Warner, or Wallace, I'm sorry. Mr. Wallace, welcome to the show.
And thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it. Glad to be here.
It's an honor to have you. I've read Cold Case Christianity when it first came out, back before it was cool, I suppose you could say. It just came out. I see it on the bookstore back when people went to bookstores.
I know, right? So
it was on a stack, and I was like, "What's this?" And then I read the premise of the book and instantly knew I had to read it. It was really I read it probably like in a day. Seriously, it was such an easy read.
I'm so glad.
And because at first there's this level of intimidation. I know about the law and investigative techniques as much as anybody else, from TV,
right?
which may not be the reality.
No, I totally get it. Get it. Yeah. This is all of us. Yeah.
I'm like, is this going to be over my head? Am I going to have to research the research to understand what he's talking about? But you did an excellent job in breaking that down to where people of my caliber could just comprehend, wow, that's a really interesting approach into doing this. So what I'd like to do first is start off quickly with Cold Case Christianity, because it ties into some degree with Person of Interest, because if I understand right, this was all sparked by a singular event, if you will. You heard a pastor who actually sounded like he believed what he was saying or something to that effect.
Yeah.
And you're age 35, and most people at age 35 are pretty set in what they're going to think. But this one sparks something in you. What was it that made that spark, and why did you decide to go full-blown detective on him like this?
Well, I guess he said that Jesus was smart, like the smartest person who had ever lived. And that for me was the kind of thing that would have provoked me, and still does. Who doesn't want to have wisdom? Who doesn't want to know what is true? And so I was more than, by the way, this doesn't even have to come from a real person. This could be from a fictional character. You get wisdom from watching movies. I like to watch, and my wife, I'll drive her crazy this way, but I'll watch movies and I'm trying to glean out that kind of that nugget, that lesson that you can use, even though this is just a fictional story. So I think there are some things you could learn from. And so I had no interest in Christianity, no interest in God, no interest in joining the church, none of that. For me, it was all just, is this guy as smart as this pastor said he was? And the pastor he positioned himself in a way, he was throwing the ball in a way I could catch it. And so for me, that's really the only way I'm ever going to take seriously if I'm going to investigate the claim, it could be anything. I'm the same way with my kids. If someone's going to make a claim, you're going to get investigated on this to make sure you're not lying to me. Right. So, I would have done that with any kind of a claim. And so it wasn't like I thought, oh, this is going to start a journey. I was not up for that. I was just trying to figure out what was so smart about Jesus. And as I read the Gospels, it was clear that these people in antiquity wrote this story thinking that we were going to believe it happened the way they said it happened. In other words, they're saying that, hey, we saw this with our own eyes. You can see this in the letters later, in Peter's letters and John's letters, that they actually touched him. They ate with them. They listened to him. They saw him do this stuff. Well, okay, that's just eyewitness accounts. And I know how to assess those. And that's what got me started.
So when you took to find out how smart he was, did you decide ahead of time, I'm going to do this like a cold case detective, or did you just start reading through the gospel? I guess I'll look at a Bible, and then did something spark in your head like, wait a minute, I should look at this from this is a cold case?
Well, I thought it was going to be more pervert. So I really was interested in fortune cookie Jesus. I don't really just give me the red letters. What is so smart about this guy?
Right. Yeah.
And not knowing what I would find. It's not like Proverbs. It'd be great if it was like Proverbs. Just give me
Yeah.
statement after statement after statement of what's so smart about Jesus. Instead, I bought a Bible and I'm opening up, I'm reading through it, and it's like, okay, well, this is going to take a little more time because this is a story about a bunch of things that happened, of which I really had no interest. I really wanted the red letters. That was it. But as I read it, I realized, oh man, these guys actually think this happened. They're actually making a claim as though it happened. And so I wasn't like, oh, I'm going to dust off my investigative. No, I
Right.
wasn't doing that. I just didn't know how else do you
Yeah.
assess this, if
Sure.
not by making. What happens is whatever you learn as a detective, at some point it's just very intuitive. At some point, it's not like you break out your notebook from that homicide class you had 15 years ago, and
Right.
you go through it and you're trying to figure out,
Yeah.
like what's true. No, you just know now from patterns of having worked these kinds of cases what the next step would be. So a lot of what I did originally was not as tidy as I wrote about it in Cold Case because I'm writing it for people who don't know what that intuitive process is. So I had to kind of break it down into pieces. When you're doing it in real time, it's not like I'm doing part 1 first, then part 2, then part 3. You're
Right.
kind of doing all of it at the same time, and it's very messy. And then you'll rabbit trail on little things. So a lot of what I did back, now it's been 24 years or
Mhm.
so. And a lot of what I did back then was very messy, and it was all happening simultaneously. And I really kind of chronicled it in 3 books. It was really the stuff I did in Cold Case Christianity, another book called God's Crime Scene, and this book, Person of Interest. All these were kind of like 3 domino runs, the domino that I was trying to push over dominoes in 3 different trails. And that's what we
Mhm.
were doing. And Susie was very patient through a lot of that process, my wife,
I
just kind
imagine
of
so.
watching me do it. I think that she didn't know anything more than I did, but she would have been less what's what I'm looking for. In other words, her bar was probably lower. Like you don't have to go to this extreme.
Mhm.
She kind of has a more intuitive sense. Okay, this feels like when our kids are talking about something, she right away makes a quick
Right.
decision about where I'm more likely to say, well, wait a minute, that this doesn't line up with that. This doesn't line up
Right.
with that.
Right.
She's not going to do that. She's got a much more intuitive response. And so I think that much less probably would have been required. I always felt like, man, especially in a case when you're working active cases, you have this sense that if I don't turn over every rock, the defense team is going to do it when we're in trial. And that's not where I want it to happen. Like, what if I've overlooked something and it's
Right.
like the deal
Right.
killer or something? I don't want the Perry Mason moment. You remember the old Perry
Yeah.
Mason show, right?
Right.
Now I'm
Right.
really dating myself. My grandmother used to love that show. So that's how old
Yeah.
that show is. And if Perry Mason was this defense attorney who
Right.
seemed like he'd be doing these real time interviews which never happens, by the way, but he'd be doing like these real time interviews and exposing the real truth on the
Right.
stand in real time. Well,
Yeah.
that's like a nightmare for most of us as detectives.
Sure.
So a lot of what I was doing was trying to taking that same approach here.
Uh,
Like I don't want to say yes to this until I've turned over everything, and
mhm.
then I'll look at the whole thing and take a look.
And again, I noticed how you worded something. You said these these guys actually believed what Jesus was saying, or that they believed
They
that the
thought this happened. They
right,
actually
they thought
aren't
this
just
happened. Did you
yes.
not expect that?
Well, if you
Was
look at
that
a
a
lot of
shock to you?
mythologies, okay, now when I say mythology, I'm not talking about false stories.
Right,
I'm
right.
talking about ancient claims related
Yes.
to deity and how the deities interact with their creation. These are mythologies. And if you read those, none of them are like the gospels.
Right.
So you'll have stories, but they don't appear to be stories written by an author who was present or had access to the people who were present, like Luke says he has in chapter 1. This is not how those are written. They're written very fanciful, and even the settings are typically very fanciful. Okay, well, this is about a narrative that begins at a point in history, locked down under the
Mhm.
reign of a particular emperor, and a particular location with real people who have names that are interacting with these and seem like they're kind of like, why even mention this guy? Because he's an eyewitness. And so they mention, so it's just very different. The texture is very different of the Gospels and others. So I kind of expected this would be a story like ancient
Uh,
mythologies, where there'll be
right.
claims about Jesus, and he might even say some things, but they wouldn't be written as if they were written by ancient people who lived in the first century who were recording what really happened.
And so that, and I guess then that's what led you to compare the witnesses' accounts, if you will, of what they experienced and saw, and you compared them as a detective would with other, in any case where this witness says this, it
Yeah.
doesn't line up with this, but
Oh,
these
absolutely.
match.
Yeah, if you
Right.
look at if you notice these, right? If you just notice if you're reading through them carefully, okay, you'll see that there are variations between the accounts in a way that
Right.
could be disturbing for some people if they aren't familiar with what this texture of eyewitness accounts looks like. But as I read through them, I saw the variations like everybody else sees them. You know, how many angels are present at the tomb? How many women go to the tomb? What does the
Right.
sign say over the cross? I mean, there's lots of little ways that there are variations, differences in the way things are described. Now, the question then becomes, how do you explain these differences?
Right.
For a lot of people, they're seen as absolute, unreconcilable contradictions, and therefore they'll say the Bible is full of contradictions. So I read those right away, and the first thing it did was provoke me to test the Gospels, because I'll tell you that when you're going to see, if you interview someone from a crime just 2 hours ago, you're going to see the same level of variation in the eyewitness accounts. It'll make you scratch your head. It also is the fertile ground for defense attorneys who would say, well, see, there you go. They're telling a lie because they can't all agree. Well, the
Right.
reality of it is that no two eyewitnesses ever agree. So when I saw those gospel accounts had that same level of variation, I said, oh boy, this has a kind of a rough texture of an eyewitness account that would the way you might encounter it today. If an
Right.
event occurred last week, I work cold cases. So these are like 2-3 decades old.
Right.
So, I mean, I'm just telling you that I thought I'm going to test these, and that's what got me started in the Gospels was the level of variation,
Uh,
because that's what you expect in real accounts. Whereas if you've got a story, there's like, you're going to get rid of all the other accounts, give me one,
right.
or they're going to make sure that they are completely scrubbed of any variation and everyone lines up perfectly. Well, that doesn't happen in the Gospels, and so I thought, boy, this is starting to feel like I should probably take it seriously.
Uh, because it would actually be a red flag, I guess you could say, if every one of the gospels said the exact same thing about the same guy,
Well,
right?
look at it this way. Do you think that skeptics would be more convinced of the reliability of Scripture if every one of those of the Gospels was word for word the same? I think they would say they'd be even worse. So you
Yes,
can't win
yes,
one way or the other with some people who will be skeptical about the Gospels. But clearly,
sure,
for me, I was looking for a certain level of variation that's within the range of expected variation. And if you've worked these accounts, and the only way I can tell you this is after you've interviewed hundreds and hundreds of witnesses, you start to get a kind of innate sense for what's the level of variation I could tolerate. I remember a very famous case just happened in Chicago where they rendered a verdict. And when they were going back and talking to the chief of police, he had a sense, when I heard this, it set off a red flag for me. And I remember I laughed when he said it because he'd been a homicide detective for years. And he said, I worked a lot of these cases. And so I knew when he said X, well, that's just because of he's interviewed so many hundreds of witnesses or victims that you can kinda spot the lie, right? Or
yes,
spot or well, even if it's not a lie, this is gonna be a problem, so we better figure out what's going on here because this doesn't sound right to me. Well, this doesn't sound right to me just is really the expressions you hear from detectives who have a lot of experience. This doesn't sound right to me. So when I read the Gospels, I was like, "Wow," I don't like the miracle parts. The miracle accounts, I was a complete committed philosophical naturalist. I rejected
right,
anything that was miraculous. So that part I thought, well, that's gotta be a lie. But boy, everything else, it's got a texture I wanted to test.
yes. Now, in Point of Interest, which is your newest book,
Yeah.
I guess, not focusing so much, say, on the witnesses, but now you're focusing on a person of interest,
Yeah.
which is going to be, in this case, Jesus Christ.
Right.
Now, explain how that. I guess that's another investigative consideration in which you would use with someone.
Yeah.
And
So
now, what?
in cold case, what you're doing is you're looking at the stuff that's in the New Testament, the claims of the eyewitnesses, and you test those eyewitnesses to see if they're reliable. And that's what we
Mhm.
tried to do. But that's only part of any investigation you do. Look, there's going to be a bunch of stuff that has nothing to do with the eyewitness. So I've had cases where a woman has been killed by her husband, and he gets rid of her body, and then he claims that she just ran off. got mad at me and she left. Never came back, never returned home, never used a credit card, never shows up anywhere on planet Earth, never come back, never calls her kids,
Right.
really? Okay. So this is now years later.
Yeah.
It's a murder investigation, and we've got no evidence from the crime scene because no one took any photographs. They believe this guy. And so there's no property evidence booked into the property room. There's nothing. Well, how do you make a case like that with nothing from the crime scene? Well, you investigate that day that she went missing was like a bomb went off, and you investigate the fuse that led up to the burning of that fuse, and then the bomb detonates, and you investigate the fallout that occurs after the bomb explodes. You can determine what happened on the day she went missing from the fuse and the fallout, even if you've got no evidence in the crime scene. Well, it turns out that even if every New Testament was destroyed, and you couldn't test the New Testament. Well, the fuse and fallout of history, everything outside the New Testament, will tell you everything you need to know about Jesus. The same way everything you need to know about the crime will be told to you by the fuse and fallout in a criminal investigation. So we just took that fuse and fallout approach to the person of Jesus and investigated him as a person. Here's a question. Something clearly happened in what today we call the first century. Something clearly happened.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it's not the first century. We're calling it that, but it's not really the first century. So why are we calling it that? Because something happened. Well, what happened? Well, if you don't know from the Gospels, you could just tell from the fuse and fallout leading up to and following the first century what really happened in the first century. And that's what we're doing in this book.
Yeah. Now, that case you mentioned, I believe you talk about in a Person of Interest, where
Yeah, I do.
He claimed she just left and was mad, but then, like you said,
Right.
nowhere to be found anywhere on planet Earth whatsoever.
Yeah, I had a case that was just like this. I mean, I try to
Yeah.
take my cases and change them slightly so that
Right.
the victims are protected, and even people who are suspects. Some of these guys are getting out of jail now on parole, and so I'm just going to try to protect their identity. But the point I'm trying to make here is that I had a case one time where a guy killed his wife, and for 30 years before I opened the case, he had convinced her family that she had just run off, to the point where they never ever called us to say, "Is anyone working our daughter's case?"
Wow.
They just assumed that he was telling the truth.
Mhm.
They didn't want to think their daughter was dead,
Mhm.
and they loved this guy. He was like the son they never had.
Wow.
He got away with it. And so this is the kind of cases you get, and you have to do that fuse and fallout approach to determine what happened.
That fuse and fallout approach, I find very intriguing. You're applying it to Jesus, like you're saying, remove the Gospels, which to me makes me seem that's scary
Well,
to
no,
start with, right?
so
But
remember when I say remove the Gospels,
right,
everything's going to point back to the Gospels. It's not like the information we're going to get about Jesus is going to come from
yeah,
someplace other than the Gospels. My point, though, is that the authors of the Gospels and Jesus of Nazareth had such a tremendous impact on history, a tremendous impact on every important aspect of human culture, that the story of Jesus from the Gospels has been repeated, rewritten, written into, recited. You could recover all of it from
yeah,
these various aspects of human culture. That's what's interesting about
yeah.
Jesus.
And that's the amazing thing. I know you weren't saying getting rid of it. I'm just saying
Right.
that even if you didn't start there and you looked at everything else, that
That's right.
that's the amazing thing, is that this all points to something amazing in this person of interest,
Yeah.
which is Jesus. So, like, feed us a little bit of, like, give us some teasers, I guess, as to what are some of the things that just go boom,
Okay,
Jesus.
so I'll just tell you that one of the things I thought was interesting in the fallout section after Jesus, because I mentioned it only because I was fascinated with the level of reconstruction you can do. Like, you would expect that in the first 300 years of the Christian era, common era, you would expect, I think, that writers who are friends of Jesus, the church fathers, for example, would probably talk a lot about scripture, and you could probably reconstruct a lot of data about Jesus just from the writings and letters of church fathers, which is true. You can. But then you'd expect that. But it turns out that the history of science is so indebted to the worldview of Jesus of Nazareth that it ends up being an igniter for the kinds of explorations of the natural world, because it initiates a worldview grounded in education, a worldview that sees God as a rational, orderly being who creates yet is distinct from his creation, so that you can examine the creation to learn something about the God of creation, that this is even seen as act of devotion and worship by the earliest scientists. And so it's not just that a few historic scientists were Christians, it's that the history of science is just littered with an overabundance and overrepresentation of important key figures, all of whom came out of a Christian worldview. And I've listed them, 950 of them. Now, again, these are all mostly in the footnotes. I call these the case notes, but I've illustrated the book with 400 illustrations so you can see the depth of which the Christian worldview is responsible for what we now call the scientific revolution. As a matter of fact, the scientists of the scientific revolution were dominantly Christ followers of every kind of denomination and stripe. And they were the founders and fathers of the major scientific disciplines we still exercise today. Everything from modern biology to quantum mechanics. And it turns out that if you look at those fathers, the fathers of the science disciplines, they wrote to each other. They wrote about Jesus. They have personal journals. They have letters. They have books they wrote about Jesus. If you collected all that data, you could reconstruct the story of Jesus robustly, more robustly than you can from the church fathers, from the work of the science fathers. There's just aspects of cult, and no other historical person in the history of historical persons has had that kind of influence on the sciences.
Wow,
period.
That's extremely interesting, because I was about to ask you that. I mean, by comparison, are there other people that might have had a similar impact?
And
But
I would
you're
always say, well,
saying,
tell me who they are.
right? Yeah, well, I wouldn't know.
Are they great philosophers who are
Right.
quoted and their stories are reconstructed by the science fathers? There aren't any. Is it a great religious leader? Well, if it is, it's not anybody other than Jesus of Nazareth. That Jesus so outbounds any other historical figure that it's hard to explain why that would be the case. As a matter of fact, it causes us to have to seek an explanation, because it's so difficult to understand how this guy from this remote corner of the Roman Empire, who was really nobody of significance, born to an insignificant family, a family that was not wealthy, that could not provide him with an education, never got married, never had children, never had a wife, never wrote a book, never led a nation, never ruled an army. This is a guy who was nobody. If you look at all the somebodies of the first century, and I have a list of these in the last chapter, compare this guy, Jesus of Nazareth, to all the other somebodies who altogether didn't have the impact on history that Jesus of Nazareth had. How do you explain that kind of impact? This is why I think there used to be this old trilemma that was could describe by C.S. Lewis, that Jesus is either lunatic, liar, or Lord, or liar, lunatic, or Lord, right? He's lying about who he said he was. He's crazy because he thought he was who he said he was, or he just is who he said he was. But it turns out there's another way to look at the new trilemma, I think, amongst this generation. And that is, he was either just an act of fiction, a creation of fiction. He never really existed. He's a fictional character. Or he might have really existed, but he was nobody important in the first century. Or he was God incarnate, who entered into his creation. Of those three options, tell me what other example you can find of a fictional character having this kind of impact on human history. I'll wait. You won't find anybody. But you also won't find another mortal human who's had this kind of impact in art, literature, music, education, science, and world religions. As a matter of fact, every other world religion, both that follow Jesus and even the ones like Hinduism and Buddhism that precede Jesus, have now incorporated Jesus into their worldview in one way or another. Either the leaders of Buddhism and Hinduism would say that Jesus fits within those constructs and is seen as an enlightened teacher on his way to Buddhahood, or he's on the pages of Scripture in the Muslim faith and the Baha'i faith, all of the world religions that follow Jesus. He's had that kind of impact on other non-Christian religions. Yet, of course, he says that no one comes to the Father except through him. He doesn't return that favor for Buddha, even though Buddha preceded him by a great period of time. Or Indra, or Hinduism, or Krishna, or Zoroaster, or whoever you can think of who precedes Jesus. Jesus, even if he was aware of all those, if you said, well, he's just another guy. Okay, but he's a guy who said that no one gets to the Father except through that guy. And of course, he did all the things that only God can do. And so I think there's a reason to believe he's in the third category, God who enters back in his creation and has exactly the kind of impact you would expect.
Yes. Also, a person of interest, though, you talk about the timing of when the event takes place. That's just, when you look at cases like the one you're talking about with the wife that disappeared. Well, he said
Right,
disappeared,
right,
left
right.
angry. That the timing of the event is just as important as the event itself. So
Yes.
you want to explain that principle and how that applies to Jesus?
Yeah, so I mean, sometimes you can determine who the killer is just by where a crime occurs, right? If it occurs in her locked apartment and only one person has a key other than she does, and it occurs at a time that, in other words, where it occurs is big because it can give you a list of candidates who might only
Right.
know how to get to that place or have access to that place. But when it occurs is every bit as telling about who could have done this, because a lot of crimes have a lot of precursor events that need to take place first, like preconditions that need to be in place, or things that happen, or a certain amount of hostility that's rising. And then there's always deadlines too you're trying to work in front of. So you have things that have to be in place before the crime can occur, and then things that have to that are determined that you can't wait too long for the crime to occur. So, for example, if she's going to leave the state and you want her dead before she leaves, well, now you got a deadline. You got to work before she
Yeah.
leaves the state.
Yes.
But if you need a certain weapon to kill her and you don't have it yet, well, now you got to get the weapon. So the red zone of opportunity is after you have the weapon before she leaves the state. That's
Yes.
the kind of opportunity window that I call a red zone. Now, it turns out that this is also true for the appearance of Jesus. Certain conditions needed to be met before he shows up, and there were certain deadlines that he had to work in front of. And we know this from a couple of different fuses that are burning toward the appearance of Jesus. We have a cultural fuse in which all of the Roman Empire is preparing itself. Even the technology of empires that preceded Rome, that to be able to have an Etruscan alphabet that could be spread across the known world by an empire on a technology called papyrus, which might sound kind of like lame, but to be honest, if you're working on wood or clay or stone,
Right. It
it's
was
just
good
not as
stuff.
it's not as mobile. Yeah, so you want to have the papyrus to work on, and then you have to have a
Right.
language in order to speak, and then not only that, you want to have the roads that you can travel on. These things come into place right before the first century. And so there's a window of opportunity. There's actually a thing called the Pax Romana, a 200-year period of peace. And in that 200-year period of peace is an explosive period of growth in the Christian faith. You also have a spiritual deadline in the sense that there are a number of ancient people groups who are worshiping gods of their imagination, but they do have certain common expectations as just people born in the image of God, created in the image of God. They think that God would probably have supernatural power. They think that God might, offer eternal life. These are things that are pretty common to anyone's ancient view of God. But if you wanted to appear when the most number of those ancients were still actively worshiping the gods that shared those common expectations, by the way, Jesus fulfills all of those common expectations most robustly. Well, then you're going to have to come before people like your gods like Osiris are no longer worshipped, and these gods are no longer being worshipped. So that's another fuse, another red zone opportunity. And finally, there, of course, are the prophecies of the Jews. And, Daniel says in Daniel 9 that the Messiah will come before the destruction of the temple. There are some deadlines that have to be met.
Right.
So if you put all of those together in an overlap, you will end up with a very small red zone in which all three fuses are lining up perfectly. And that runs from about 29 BC to about 70 AD. About 100 years. And
Wow.
in the middle of that 100 years, that 33 years in the middle, are the life of Jesus of Nazareth. And when you
Right.
see that, I think you'll be impressed to see that when Paul says that God sends his son in the fullness of time, and then you look at that red zone, and this is why it's hard to explain. And if you see there's that one chapter 5, I think probably has 30 illustrations, just showing the way the red zone constructs. And when you see it finally in the last illustration,
Mm.
I think you'll find there's power in that, and you'll understand better, especially at a season of Christmas, why it is that Jesus comes in the fullness of time and what Paul means by that when he uses that expression.
So you think this is more than just say this isn't a man born out of historical coincidences. You're saying
Well,
this is something a priori that had to be lined up to launch to have this impact of the explosion that Jesus brought on the planet.
Well, I think it absolutely could be a coincidence. All of it. No, this is because the nature of the kind of work I do. If you ask me if something is possible, I'm always going to say yes. But the question isn't whether something is possible. The question is whether that's reasonable, because the standard of proof is not beyond a possible doubt; it's beyond a reasonable doubt. And so and that's why I'll say, was it possible that he didn't do this, that this is just a bunch of bad luck, that he happens to catch every piece of evidence that makes him look like he's guilty when it's actually not him? Well, yes, that's
Right.
possible,
Yeah.
but it's not reasonable.
Yeah.
And
Right.
that's where I think most of us don't live under the standard of possible doubt, because as
Mm.
judges say in California, I can level a possible or imaginary doubt against anything you say you believe. So that's why we don't operate at that level. We operate at what's reasonable. And I think when you see the case, the cumulative case for the fuses alone, forget about the fallout, just the fuses alone, I think you'll say, well, if that's a coincidence, it's a dang good one.
Yeah, it sure is. So, person of interest, where can I find that at?
Well, our website is personofinterestbook.com. And here's my hope. Look, in the end, I get a chance to write books. It's so great. I didn't think I would have this opportunity, and I had a career as a cold case detective. Had no idea this was coming. So I love that I get to write books, but that's not really where my heart is. My heart is that the church will learn what's true and pass it on to the next generation. Because a lot of the reason why we're surprised at the fuse and fallout of history is because apparently we didn't study it that way. No one taught it to us that way. And we missed what was obvious. We're standing on the shoulders of a civilization built by the Christian worldview, and really has blossomed because of the Christian worldview. Yet no one ever attributes any of it to the Christian worldview. So my hope is that we will teach this to others. And so what we do when we write books like this is that I try to create all the teaching materials. So if you go to personofinterestbook.com, you'll see that if anyone purchases the book, we try to provide, well, we will provide for them an example of maybe 5 or 6 videos of me teaching the material to an audience. So you can see how you could teach it. And I will also provide to you a 525 all visual illustrated animated PowerPoint that you can actually use in your setting. And I also provide 90 Bible inserts, which you can then pass out to your class so they can put them in their Bible so they'll know how to teach this to their own kids. Because the reality of it is that our goal is to make sure that others can share what's true.
And I think this is an awesome way in which to present it. It's eye opening. It answers, I guess, questions that Christians themselves may have,
Yeah.
but it's also which strengthens your faith, but it also opens the eyes of others who are natural skeptics,
Yeah.
and it gives them something tangible in which to chew on to say, "Hey, this Jesus fella is not normal. He's beyond normal. He's super normal."
Yeah, and I think that this is something that, I agree. When you write a book like this, sure, lots of people will buy it and give it to their friends. But what I always want to tell people is, hey, before you give it to your friend, you read it, because in the end, it's your relationship with somebody who's skeptical, plus the information that you already have that makes that information powerful when shared with somebody, right? I don't have that personal relationship with people, but if you just learn what it is first, because at some point there's going to be a question raised, you gave me this book, and what about this? Well, who's going to get to answer that question? It's going to be you. So
Exactly.
my hope is that we learn to become the best communicators of what is true.
J. Warner Wallace, person of interest. It's been very awesome having you with us today. I really appreciate it, sir.
Hey, thanks for having me. I so appreciate you.
You're listening to Rage of the Age. Rage of the Age. Politics, religion, economics, and history with a conservative bend.
Welcome to the essay segment. Before I begin, I want to once again thank you for your patience that many of you have had in waiting for this next episode to come out. It has been some months, and I just want to quickly explain why that was the case, and hopefully you can give me a little bit of forgiveness in this matter. And then I hope to get back into the swing of things again. But the last episode I presented, during the essay segment, I was bringing up something that was very, it still worries me and disturbs me to some degree, but the loose talk of what an insurrection is and what it would really look like in this country. When I poured that out, it really hit me. I had to take a break for a bit to recover from that, I guess you can say, because I don't like the imagery that conjures up in my head of what could happen to this nation. So I took a break for a bit. I believe I've written a blog here or there to fill some of the gap, and I do apologize for the delay. If you've been looking for content, I'm sorry for that. I do hope to get back and swing of things again. And what better way to start again than with a wonderful interview with J. Warner Wallace. He's a great writer. If you've never read his books, he really does truly break down profound things into a manner that is very digestible. And when you read through it, you're almost done with the book the minute you start. He writes it very simply, but it grabs you in. It just all the vantage points and things that he looks at really jumps at you and just grabs a hold of your attention. You want to see how the conclusions that he brings that it all is brought to, and he really makes you think, which is a type of person I am. I want to think. I want you to, if you want me to be in line with what you're saying, if you don't appeal to my intellect, you've lost me. I'm sorry. It's just not going to happen. And that's what he does in his works. I definitely suggest, especially for Christmas time, for yourself, of course, to order A Person of Interest, which is his recent book, but also God's Crime Scene, Cold Case Christianity, some of his other works, where he approaches this from a very intellectual perspective, which if you're of that mindset and you want to have something presented to you in an intellectual manner, this guy does it. And I definitely recommend that for yourself and for your intellectual thinking friends. Definitely get this as a Christmas present for them. It's something they would really appreciate. What I want to talk about today in the essay segment, first off, is this idea of believing what you're saying. Mr. Wallace, of course, was saying that's one of the things that stuck out is like these guys were actually believing who Jesus was, that they were talking as if they were a part of it and they believed it. And of course he mentioned the pastor that said Jesus was the smartest man who ever lived. Well, that got him, to think, because this guy said it like he kind of believed it. And it got me to thinking that, and I must say, and I'm not happy with this, but this is something that, for those of you who think you're called to ministry, you might want to consider this yourself. I've sat under sermons, and many of you probably have, or you heard explanations of things, and it's almost as if the person saying it or bringing the message doesn't even believe it themselves. Or they're on some crazy tangents, they're just saying whatever, and you even wonder yourself, do you even believe what you're saying? And it got me thinking that, I don't know, maybe there's an element of that missing from a lot of teaching from Christian principles. And I say this because I have noticed over the years that there seems to be times where many Christians feel embarrassed about certain things within the Bible or certain doctrines, and they feel uneasy about it, so that when they're challenged on it and these people want an intellectual discourse about it, how do you defend this or how do you explain this? It's almost like we're not, how can I say it, interested enough. We don't believe it enough to even want to defend it. We just kind of try to brush it under the rug or something. And I don't know. I'm quite tired of seeing this this embarrassment, if you will, about something that was written in the Bible or a particular viewpoint. And it's like, quit being embarrassed about it. Do you believe it or not? And if you believe it, why are you embarrassed? I mean, it reminds me of the word of Jesus. It says, if you're embarrassed of me, if you disown me before men, I'll disown you before the Father. And yet it's almost like, okay, they just do it anyway, disregard. It's when you listen to someone who really believes what they're saying, that's what comes across to you, doesn't it? You hear it and you listen to it and you hear what they're telling you, and you may not at first believe what they're saying, but you instinctively know they actually believe what they're saying. And I definitely think that would be a great point to begin when we discuss the Christian faith. I want to share something with you from the past. This is from the 1800s. There was an evangelist in the nation at the time during one of the Great Awakenings by the name of Charles Finney. He was talking with a man about the Christian faith, and this man happened to be an elocution expert, which was a big thing back then, that you would hire these experts to perfect your public speaking. And this elocution expert was explaining that he had many clients who were pastors, and he was saying that I could tell they didn't even believe the Christian religion by the way they spoke. And I want to actually share the wording from this guy as he related to Charles Finney, so that you can hear it yourself. This is some very profound stuff that I think you need to be, many of you maybe need to be challenged with it, and maybe this will help you choose the type of pastors you let speak into your life. But let me go ahead and read this to you. I have been 14 years employed in teaching elocution to ministers, and I know they do not believe the Christian religion. Whether the Bible is true or not, I know these ministers do not believe it. I can demonstrate that they do not. The perfection of my art is to teach them to speak naturally on the subject. I go to their studies and converse with them, and they speak eloquently. I say to them, gentlemen, if you will preach naturally, just as you speak on any other subject in which you are interested, you do not need to be taught. That is just what I am trying to teach you. I hear you talk on other subjects with admirable force and eloquence. Then I see you go into the pulpit, and you speak and act as if you do not believe what you are saying. I have told them again and again to talk in the pulpit as they naturally talk to me, yet I cannot make them do it, and so I know they do not believe the Christian religion. Now, that's quite an accusation. But it's this I receive with force. I hear this. And of course, he's telling this to Charles Finney, who is one of the guys who did actually believe what he was saying. And the force of his preaching had an impact upon the nation during its time frame. I think Finney understood what he was saying is true as well. The thing is when you hear something from someone who really believes it, they speak more convincingly. The question is, why are so many people repeating stuff they don't believe, but they feel they have to repeat it? I mean, this is a whole matter of conscience. This is a matter of hypocrisy. Now, remember, hypocrisy is more acting. We tend to think of do as I say, not as I do, which is a form of it. But really, Jesus is talking about you're being an actor. You're pretending. How many pretenders do we have who are reciting what they're supposed to say about the Christian religion, and yet they really don't believe it? Man, it's really a travesty. I think what we need is more those of you who really believe what you believe. You need to speak out more, and it needs to be heard because it is lacking, and we really need that impact in our society again. We don't need to hear the same cliches. We don't need to hear the same bumper sticker sayings. We don't need to have the typical recitations of different things, and this is the way it's supposed to say it. Just if something's just said with utmost integrity and belief, that has impact. Not the cookie cutter version, but the actual thing. And I think we need more of that. Those of you who have that belief, you need to share it because you're going to sound like you believe it, which is the beginning of an impact. That's what sticks with people. It's one thing to recount what you heard is true and you're just passing it on because, well, I guess I just have to pass it on. But it's another when it's like you speak of it as if you know for sure. Now that speaks volumes. And with that in mind, I I want to talk about then the Bible itself. Mr. Wallace explained how when he looked at the gospel accounts, they looked like they were written by people who believed what they saw. Like it's coming from people who actually witnessed the account. So this isn't like somebody hearing it from somebody who heard it from somebody and passing it on. And, oh, yeah, and I kind of heard this. You can tell the difference from someone who was there versus someone who's like, well, I heard this might have happened. You can tell by the force of the communication. And when he compares these gospels, of course, there's this connection that, these are people who were a part of something that was taking place because of this man, Jesus. I want to just present a little challenge, I suppose. Of course, many think of the Bible, and some of the content is, with the miracles, can be off-putting to many people. But I want to challenge you to read the Scripture, especially the New Testament, because the New Testament talks about what Jesus started and how it grew, and that's the primary focus. There's a lot more focus on people who were impacted by Jesus and them expressing this. But read through the Scripture as if it's a history. I mean, if you have to, for a moment, set aside the miracles as well, that just seems, really fantastic. That's, I don't know if I can deal with it. Okay, just chart that up as how they explain it if you want to. But look at the vast majority of all the material besides that is really a history. As he explained before, all the other myths, as he explained the myths, are very fantastic. I mean, they are more fantastic than it looks like in the Christian scripture. Whereas within the Bible itself, you have datings that take place. They give time frames. You have actual people that that are verified in other sources as existing. So it isn't like we dream. People weren't dreamed up. It wasn't a totally fictional story. That you have events that had actually taken place. I mean, a lot of the history that we understand comes from the Scripture itself too. Read it like it's a history. And see if that maybe gives you a different impact than you would as if you came at it just a religion book. It's a book of rules, or it's a book of fantastic ideas. Look at the history in it. And it's written as a narrative. A lot of it's written as narrative. You have the poetry, you have the figurative language, you have all that. But you know what? We have that now. That doesn't make us crazy. Maybe. But read most of it, a good bit of it is narrative, and it's explaining what's taking place that people had actually witnessed and seen. And then consider their extravagant claims, if you will. Because these aren't people making up crazy ideas out of nothing. They are born into context and into a life. They live that life. And as they're going through that life, they experience these things that God has done by intervening. And it's spread out over a period of time. So it's not like every day this happens. It's like every so often there's these interactions with God. And because they don't happen every day, they really get your attention. And it got their attention, and they capture it. And they preserve it for future generations to see. So when you put them all together, you see this amazing connection of God's intervention into history. And I would even say the potential for God to intervene, not just in history as in it's the past, but even in our world and time and even your life today. And with that, because of this Christmas season, it's Christmas. Why? It's celebrated around the world. Why? Because of one man, because of Jesus Christ. And it's a Christian holiday that it celebrates the birth of Jesus Christ. That's what we're celebrating. And it's not just because he happened to be born, and he's another feller, the claim is this, that he was conceived by the Holy Spirit and born of a virgin, that he is God with us. He is God become a man. He's the express image of God the Father, and we see him through the Son, Jesus Christ, and yet they are one God. I know, mind-blowing, and good luck trying to even explain it today to anyone who thinks they know. But that's what makes this so amazing, is that God has reached out and intervened into human lives in order to redeem those human lives. And that's the great aspect of the story of Christmas. We exchange gifts, but the greatest gift is the one God gave us when he became man and walked among us. And he did that for our sake. And he did it to save us from our sins, from our wrongs, from our evils. And yes, you know we all have them. You know you have them. He came to save from that. When you couldn't do it, he did. In all of our imaginations of trying to be right with God and the divine and how we're supposed to live, God himself simply did it because we are going to fail. He provided a means in this amazing gift, in this person of Jesus, who has turned this world upside down and continues to affect it and continues to impact lives and change mindsets and to turn things around. Despite the evil around us, the impact of Jesus continues to grow. It continues to expand. Light is greatly increasing. And I would just want to share that light with you, that if you are a skeptic, look, there are many of us who used to be skeptics. Mr. Warner was a skeptic. I'm a naturally skeptic person. There are all kinds of skeptics. Very intellectual people who have been brought to faith through intellectual reasons, not through the emotion, not through the hype. That there's something that had just absolutely convinced us, and it's that evidence of the things unseen. It's the evidence that points towards this invisible thing, which is God. Because that's what faith really is. It's the evidence of things that are not seen. It's the substance of things hoped for. That's what faith really is. Whatever definition you have, the definition of faith as known in the Bible and everyone who believes is that there are evidences we see that point to the invisible God, who is the master of the universe and who had become man in Jesus and walked with us. Merry Christmas.
You've been listening to Rage of the Age. If you loved today's podcast, make sure to leave a review on the media you're listening through. Secure future episodes by heading over to rageoftheage.com and clicking the RSS feed button. Until next time, this has been Rage of the Age.